Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. For centuries, the Babylonian Talmud has been the central religious work studied by Jewish scholars all over the world. Written and compiled during the early centuries of the Common Era, the Babylonian Talmud is a huge anthology of legal debates, folkloric legends, biblical exegesis, ethical exhortations, and much more. And it has, more than any other text, influenced Jewish life and practice. In recent decades, scholars studying the Talmud have begun to pay closer attention to the various contexts in which the Talmud was written, with some arguing that investigating the religious, cultural, and historical contexts within which the Talmud was written is key to arriving at a correct understanding of many of its passages. Among those who have advocated for closer attention to be paid to these Babylonian contexts is a foremost authority on the subject, Dr. Shai Secunda, who is the Jacob Neusner Professor in the History and Theology of Judaism at Bard College. He also directs the Interdisciplinary Study of Religions program at Bard College and is a contributing editor to the Jewish Review of Books. Professor Secunda's 2014 book, The Iranian Talmud, Reading the Bavli in its Sasanian Context, was a significant milestone in the study of this intriguing subject. And it is our pleasure to host him today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Professor Secunda, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, JJ.
Excellent. Well, I'm very excited to get into today's discussion. So let's jump into the very basics. The Babylonian Talmud, many people read it, many people excavate it, analyze it, but could you walk us through perhaps the historical background, the context a little bit? What centuries does it cover? Where was it written? Who was in charge? What were the major political and cultural forces in which it existed?
That's a tall order, but I'll try to do it as best as I can within the shortest amount of time possible. So the Babylonian Talmud is one of two Talmuds, actually. It is the Talmud that was produced in Babylonia, which is in modern-day Iraq. It is organized as a commentary on the Mishnah. That is, all of the names of the tractates which the Babylonian Talmud covers are the names of those Mishnaic tractates that it covers. And it was produced, I'd like to say, rather than written, between the 3rd century and something like the 6th century. Now, already when you talk about Talmud and Talmud scholarship, you're entering into great debates, and even the way I just presented that is controversial. Some scholars would say that it was produced solely in the 6th century. Others would say it was produced gradually from the 3rd century to the 6th century. But if we want to keep things general, we could say that the production begins in the 3rd century, and it comes to a close, at least I'm of the school, sometime in the 6th century. Now, the Babylonian Talmud, as noted, is one of two Talmuds. The other Talmud was produced in the land of Israel, known as the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, although it was not produced in Jerusalem, rather mainly in the Galilee. That context was in the Roman Empire. The context of the Babylonian Talmud was in a different empire entirely, which was the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian Empire was a powerful Iranian empire, which ruled the Middle East and Central Asia, and even points beyond, from more or less actually the time in which the Talmud was produced. They came to power towards the beginning of the 3rd century in 224, 226. And they ruled the region into the 7th century, at which point they were really decimated by the Islamic conquests. So there's an interesting correlation, and maybe that's one of the things we could talk about, between historical, perhaps coincidence, perhaps not, between this powerful empire and its chronological spread and the chronological spread of the Babylonian Talmud.
Interesting. Okay, perhaps we may get there. But another very important context that we must touch on to start the conversation is the religious context. As you've written in your book and elsewhere, it seems that the major religious context was that of the Zoroastrian faith, although there were other religious minorities and other religious trends going on in Babylonia at the time. So could you perhaps talk a little bit, give the viewers who perhaps don't have a background in the study of religion, a little bit of a background on what the Zoroastrian faith was, what it comprised of, and its basic tenets, at least as is relevant to its interplay with the rabbis in Babylonia at the time.
Certainly. So the Zoroastrian faith, the Zoroastrian religion, first of all, it should be mentioned, is one of a number of religions that flourished in this part of the world. I believe it's perhaps one of the most important religions for understanding the Sasanian Empire and also understanding Babylonian Jewry and the Babylonian Talmud, primarily for political reasons. It was the religion that was closely aligned, at times identical, with the Sasanian state. Much of besides the faith of the kings themselves, much of the bureaucratic structure was Zoroastrian. It seems that in order to become a judge or certain kinds of judges, and in order to participate in other aspects of ruling the empire, one went to a kind of Zoroastrian finishing school. So although there are other important religions to talk about in this context, including Eastern Christianity, Zoroastrianism is key. Now, what is Zoroastrianism? Many people know this religion from one of a few places. They might have a pop cultural frame of reference, and they know that Freddie Mercury, from Queen, was a Parsi, which is a part of the Zoroastrian community. Perhaps the more intellectuals among us might have heard of Zoroastrianism through Nietzsche. One of Nietzsche's most important works is framed, well, the title even is Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and is framed as the philosophy is conveyed through the philosophical discoveries that are made by Zarathustra, which is the Iranian version of the name Zoroaster. But many people know very little about this once very powerful religion. So number one, it continues to exist, a very, very old religion. Its roots go back as early as the second millennium BC, and it seems to have been, as it was with the Sasanians, closely associated with some of the Achaemenids. These were the kings that came to power after, actually, they had something to do with the fall of Babylonia. And kings like Darius, Cyrus, perhaps even, was associated with this religion. So the first thing to note is it is very old. It is a very old religion. Another thing to note is that even linguistically or culturally as well, it is not a Semitic religion. It is an Indo-Iranian religion. It traces its roots to cultures that entered into the Iranian plateau even earlier, around 2000 BC. And it's just framed quite differently for those who are knowledgeable about ancient religions than some of the ancient religions we know about from the ancient Near East. It is another important fact to know about Zoroastrianism is it seems one of its most striking characteristics is that it's a dualistic religion. First of all, this is important in the sense of evil and good being the two poles that sort of drive the world and the history of the world. It is an ethical dualism, or sometimes we think of it even, we'll call it an ethical dualism, where, of course, you're on the side of the good and you adhere to the God who's associated with the side of the good and want to further the aims of defeating evil. But evil is an independent, for most of Zoroastrian theology, an independent entity, which needs to be taken extremely seriously. So philosophically, that perhaps is one of the most important aspects of this religion from antiquity until the present day. Another thing to note, and this is especially relevant for thinking about the rabbis and the Talmud, is it is a very ritually sophisticated religion. It is a religion that takes ritual quite seriously, invested intellectually an enormous amount of energy in the development and understanding of ritual. And it's left us fascinating texts, which perhaps we'll soon get to, which were produced, part of them were produced around the time when the Talmud was composed, and seem to, in certain respects, speak in a similar koine from the kind of scholastic mode of thinking that the rabbis developed as well.
Interesting. I suppose I should add the caveat that when I asked about the Zoroastrian religion, of course, that assumes a word and a concept, religion, which is, obviously a strong Western tilt in how we understand what a religion is and can be, and therefore may be somewhat inappropriately applied to systems that come from other parts of the world and from different parts of history. So within this Zoroastrian milieu, let's say, you have the writings of the rabbis which developed that. And so I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, within the Bavli itself, what indications do we have, or what attitudes can be seen among the rabbis towards these other religions and other systems that we have? Was there admiration? Was there disdain? Was there opposition or hostility? In what ways can we glimpse interactions or attitudes the rabbis had towards the larger religious and cultural context they were in?
Great question. And I should preface it by saying and by reminding listeners who are familiar with the Talmud that, of course, there are, and I'll get to direct references to Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrian clergy, etc. But one of the difficulties, but I think invigorating difficulties in trying to place the Talmud in its context, is it doesn't often explicitly deal with the context in which it was composed. Of course, it was composed in the context. Everything is composed in the context. However, the Talmud is, like most religious texts in late antiquity, it is quite inwardly focused. It's interested in the kinds of things that interest the rabbis, that catch their attention, that they find to be religiously meaningful and valuable. And even, again, as mentioned, the structure of the text looks backwards. Much of it is trying to understand the Mishnah, that earlier rabbinic text produced in the land of Israel. And it also looks, right, geographically elsewhere. So often a lot of what we find is sort of between the lines or stray comments and stray stories that bring us into more directly the context of the Sasanian Empire, and particularly in our conversation now with Zoroastrianism. Now, we do have a number of very colorful anecdotes that involve, generally speaking, Babylonian rabbis who encounter various figures, people, holders of positions in the Sasanian Empire. These could be Sasanian kings, people like King Shapur. There were two important King Shapurs, one in the 3rd century, who comes up in conversation with the early Amora Shmuel. Another, the second King Shapur, also comes up a bit in the Talmud. He's often in conversation with Rava, who lived in the 4th century when he lived. And some of those conversations, as much as they're describing meetings between a political figure and a rabbi, also involve religion in interesting ways. We also have a number of stories that describe encounters with Zoroastrian clergy. These go by various terms. One term or one cognate, which might be familiar to some some listeners, is Gusha, Magus, right? These encounters are very interesting. Some of them have obvious theological import, and almost all of them are highly negative, to answer your other question. The rabbis do not seem to look fondly upon this religion, even while they do seem to, generally speaking, have a fairly positive attitude towards the kings, and even despite the fact that these kings are associated with the religion. So we have our anecdotes, we have our references. There is not a lot of them, but there's a sizable amount of these sources, and they're really fun to read deeply and carefully to glean what they can tell us about the relationship between the rabbis and their Zoroastrian context.
Fascinating. Could you, perhaps just offhand give one example? I'm very curious, because in other ways, when we talk about interactions between, let's say, Jewish sages and non-Jewish sages, the Talmud and other rabbinic literature do have this. So, for example, you have several conversations between, let's say, Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, who's Roman governor, who's also supposed to be some sort of Roman intellectual of some kind and represent, let's say, the pagan Greco-Roman religion. And of course, the Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus conversations reflect how the rabbis imagined a conversation might go between the greatest Jewish sage of the time and the greatest, most powerful Greco-Roman intellectual of the time. And I'm curious, how does the Talmud imagine such a, how does it frame a conversation between the great Jewish representative, the great Jewish sage of the time, and the great Zoroastrian sage? What do they talk about? And also, are there differences, just the ideas, or sort of methodological difference, or a difference in basically seeing the world? I mean, could you perhaps give an example which highlights how these differences are portrayed in rabbinic literature?
Yes. So, I mean, one well-known and very entertaining source is an encounter between a fifth-generation Amora named Amemar and an unnamed figure who goes by his title. He's an Amgusha, right? A magus. And it is a theological debate. And it's a theological debate that really describes an encounter between a monotheist, right? A rabbi who believes in one God, worships that God, and a magus, a Zoroastrian priest of some sort, who believes that the world can be divided quite evenly between good and evil. So in this little encounter, we have, on the one hand, the Zoroastrian priest saying, I believe that one can even map good and evil onto the human body. He says to Amemar, from your waist and upwards is associated with Ormazd, Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian good God, so to speak. And from your waist and downward, which is seen as negative in many cultures, is associated with Ahriman, the evil spirit. So there you have it, right? We have this division between these forces of good and evil, even mapped onto the human body.
This dualism that you were mentioning earlier.
This dualism, exactly. Amemar responds, it's humorous, but there's great wisdom there. He says, well, if that's the case, why is it when I take a drink of water, I have that drink of water, and then later on, I need to go to the bathroom? It seems that there is a correlation, a connection between these two parts of the body. They work harmoniously, and he actually phrases it in a way that the Zoroastrian priest would appreciate. How is it that Ahriman, that evil spirit who's associated with the lower part of the body, allows the water to pass, which is associated with the upper half, with Ormazd, into his territory? And that's sort of the mic drop. The conversation ends there. Well, it actually doesn't only end there, because we have Zoroastrian sources, one of which is produced a few centuries after the Talmud in the 9th century, stages a debate. This time it's not between a Zoroastrian and a Jew, but a Zoroastrian and another kind of monotheist, a Muslim. And the conversation is almost exactly the same. It's remarkable, except because it's a Zoroastrian source, the Zoroastrian wins the debate and gets the final word. But one can see how a debate like this would be described, would be imagined, and I think would be quite meaningful, certainly meaningful enough for the rabbis of the Talmud to choose to include it within the Babylonian Talmud.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. Of course, this question of how the realm of evil can allow the realm of good in, or vice versa, is very much present in later centuries of Jewish thought, specifically within Kabbalah and the sort of the interactions between one side of the Sefirot and the other side of the Sefirot, and how the evil could penetrate the good, or vice versa. I mean, it's interesting that in the times of the Gemara, that's seen as a concern of the Zoroastrians, as it were, more than that of the rabbis. I want to ask as well a little bit about the specter of persecution, which is not very cheery thing to think about. But of course, always when talking about the interaction of a Jewish minority with a non-Jewish majority, you often have to ask the question: well, to what extent was there a discrimination and persecution of the Jews, and to what degree did that color the Babylonian rabbis' understanding, firstly politically, but also religiously, of the culture in which they were in? To what extent, or let's ask firstly, to what extent was there persecution? And secondly, how is that reflected, and how does that come to the fore in the writings of the Babylonian Talmud?
Sure. And this is really, an unfortunate conversation. which I guess we have to have whenever we're doing a Jewish history. But we also have to do it carefully, not to assume what's often referred to as this kind of lachrymose approach to Jewish history, where persecution is somehow the defining feature of Jews in their encounter with non-Jewish peoples, especially if those non-Jews are the majority. Certainly, there was friction. We know there was friction between Zoroastrians and Jews, and for that matter, between Zoroastrians and other religious minorities. The second you use the word persecution, though, it gets personal. And I'm not sure it always is personal in the case of this friction between Zoroastrians and Jews. Often it doesn't seem to discriminate between non-Zoroastrians, be they Jews or Christians. So that's important to keep in mind. This is kind of an equal opportunity form of, if we want to call it persecution or friction. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the Zoroastrians took ritual very seriously, and it was ritually focused. When Jews or others did things that bothered Zoroastrians from a ritual perspective, the Zoroastrians would, at least some of them, I should say, would lash out. This includes things like a whole area of Zoroastrian ritual having to do with purity, with not contaminating various things which were seen as sacred. That could be the earth, and for that reason, Zoroastrians did not bury bodies in the ground to decompose there and to contaminate the earth. Rather, they used other methods to protect the earth from impurity, from contamination. And for that reason, they would dig up corpses, at least against some Zoroastrian figures. We have evidence of this in Christian texts, and we have evidence of it in the Talmud itself. We even have kind of jockeying, halachic jockeying of what to do in such a context. When you need to bury as quickly as possible in order not to run into issues with the authority. How does this, for example, affect if someone dies on the second day of the festival, which is, of course, only a rabbinic, one only has to not bury for rabbinic reasons? Can those rules be relaxed because of this context? Similarly, we seem to have concern with fire. Zoroastrians, actually, the center of the Zoroastrian cult was worship of fire, and part of that worship entailed protecting the fire from various contaminating forces. One of the elements of the dress of Zoroastrian priests was actually to wear a mask, which would protect the fire from the breath, which was seen as contaminating the flame. So we have evidence in Christian texts and also in the Talmud that sometimes Zoroastrians were not happy with how non-Zoroastrians handled fire. So we even have references to this affecting lighting candles, lighting Hanukkah candles, and that sort of thing. So most of those references in the Talmud do not seem to be personal. It's not persecution that, let's say, the kind of thing we find in a Christian context in other centuries where it's quite personal and it has to do with deep theological issues. But I'm not going to say it didn't happen, and it clearly was part of the experience of living as a Jew in a Zoroastrian empire.
Was there any awareness among the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud, in the Bavli specifically, that there might have been a difference for Jews living, let's say, in the Roman world or under Roman pagan religions versus Zoroastrianism? I mean, I know that references to these other religions are very slight and sparse, so it's unlikely to have a very great effect. But I mean, because there is this traffic between Bavel and Eretz Israel, and people going back and forth, and in the east they say this, in the west they say that. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm very curious as to whether there might have been a difference for those living not in the Sasanian Empire, not under the within the ambience of Zoroastrian religion, an awareness of some kind of difference, the level of Avodah Zarah, or the level of treating the religions differently depending on where you lived.
Sure, and I think normally this was not these differences were not appreciated in terms of theology, but again in the practical sphere. So, for example, you mentioned Avodah Zarah. There's a list of festivals which already the Mishnah and sources from the land of Israel describe various practices and also various dates, various pagan festivals, which affect Jewish law in various ways. Actually, both the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud Yerushalmi ask, okay, wonderful, we have these uh, Greco-Roman festivals. What are the Persian ones? And then they proceed to list different days on which the rabbis should be aware that they can't do certain things because it is the Persian festival. So they certainly were aware on the practical level that the non-Jews that they encountered with regularly practice differently, believe differently than the ones that their brethren in the land of Israel encountered. There are also hints of kind of more broad assessments about what was going on. There's one really fascinating passage where, in one way or another, the rabbis seem to want to define what kind of phenomenon is amgushata, Magianism, maybe something like Zoroastrianism, maybe a particular practice. And we have two Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, from the third century, who debate the status of this religion, perhaps in ways that are reminiscent of debates in other times and other places when medieval rabbis talked about the status of Christianity, of Islam. This perhaps is somewhere in that same broader Jewish discourse of, okay, we realize that we're confronting a specific type of tradition. What is it? How do we classify it? How do we think about it using halachic, rabbinic categories?
Interesting. Okay, so I'd like to move on to perhaps the big question, the elephant for anyone, especially the religious Jews studying, who open a book like yours or who go into this particular field, which is that of influence. And the question of, okay, so you have the Babylonian rabbis who are debating and formulating halacha within this context. And the answer is, can we find within Babylonian Talmud elements of the Persian, Sasanian, Zoroastrian religions reflected there within practices or ideas that that came to exist within the Babylonian Talmud? Was the Babylonian Talmud the development of it and development subsequently of Jewish law and practice? Does it have traces of the influences of these religions in which the rabbis were living and writing?
Yes, and the answer is yes, and I believe the answer would be yes in virtually any historical and cultural context. As I mentioned earlier, the Talmud was written in a Persian context. Everything was composed in a context, and in one way or another, the fact that it was produced in a particular time and place affected how it developed, how the conversations took place. The word influence, and that is the elephant in the room, gives a certain valence and a certain connotation of the kind of thing we expect to find. A direct adoption of a practice of some sort. We don't seem to have, and I challenge you to find in the history of religions many cases in which one religion or members of one religion say, oh, wow, look, they do things differently. Let's adopt one of those practices from a neighboring religion. That doesn't happen, and that's really not how society works. It doesn't seem to be certainly what was going on in the case of the Talmud. But rather, it was just Jewish discussions were happening, rabbinic discussions were happening, rabbinic law was developing, and it was developing in a real time and place that involved things like Zoroastrianism. Sometimes that would be, and that influence would happen on very practical grounds. I mentioned a couple of examples earlier, the laws of burial, and also the laws of Hanukkah. I think in the case of the laws of Hanukkah, there's something quite interesting happening. On the one hand, it's possible that one of the reasons why the allowances are made not to publicly place the Hanukkah menorah outside in a vulnerable place was because of this concern that Zoroastrians would come and take it and confiscate it. That seems to be what one passage in the Talmud is saying.
Is this because they venerated fire? Is that the issue?
That's right. They venerated fire, and as I mentioned, they were sometimes upset with the way they perceived non-Zoroastrians, like Jews and Christians, to be dealing with fire. So that would be on the almost not a negative example, but an example where Jewish law was affected because it was formulated in a difficult, frictive, context. On the other hand, it's been argued that perhaps actually the survival of Hanukkah and the way in which Hanukkah turned into a great Jewish fire fest has to do with the Zoroastrian context. And hear me out.
I'm very curious. Please make your case, because this is news to me, and this is kind of fascinating.
This appears in an article by Jeffrey Herman, and I think it's an interesting argument worth hearing. Hanukkah, of course, is one festival of many festivals that commemorate different events in the Second Temple period, especially involving the Hasmoneans. Almost all of those festivals have been utterly forgotten, and actually the Talmud describes that these festivals were nullified. In the case of Hanukkah, there's actually not really a good reason to celebrate this festival if you think about it. I mean, now we have much theology and beautiful, thinking about this, but the rabbis are living after the temple is destroyed. It no longer exists. And they're celebrating a point where the Second Temple was rededicated. It seems rather moot. The whole thing is gone. It's no longer with them. Why would they be celebrating this thing? And in fact, the holiday barely comes up in the Mishnah. It comes up literally in passing, and it seems virtually to have died out as part of this process of these festivals from Megillat Tanit, from this list of festivals associated mainly with the Hasmoneans. It's only actually in the Babylonian Talmud that suddenly we get a very sizable chunk of text dedicated to developing the laws of this holiday, describing the fire as being holy, an almost unprecedented idea in Judaism. So I think it's worth considering kind of the reverse. On the one hand, maybe there's a direct effect of Zoroastrianism where they have to take the candelabra inside. On the other hand, maybe the survival of the festival has to do with them operating in a context where it made sense to have a fire festival, a festival of lights, because they knew what it looked like.
Okay, that's one interesting example. I would ask, I mean, you've made one very large case study that you've particularly made hay on in this particular regard is that of Nida, or of menstruation. And you wrote your second book called The Talmud's Red Fence, Oxford University Press, available in bookstores, in good bookstores everywhere. But there you make a particular case study of this kind of interesting interaction between the popular religions at the time and Judaism. Of course, for those who don't know, large parts of what we would call today, or what we'd recognize as Hilchot Nida, of the laws regarding female menstruation and the purity laws around that, were recorded for the first time in the Babylonian Talmud. I mean, it grew up, shall we say, within this context, which the Sasanians and Persians surrounding the Jewish communities at the time took very seriously. And if you could speak a little bit as to that, as to, Nida, the laws of menstruation, perhaps being an example, and what it teaches about these interactions, and how that formed halacha as it came to be known.
Sure. I mean, so in this case, I would have to say that the key word is it's complicated. It's extremely complicated. And part of the complication has to do with the fact that this is not an area of Jewish law that suddenly appeared in Babylonia. Of course, the basis of it appears already in the Torah. But we also have an entire tractate in the Mishnah that's dedicated to this. And at least a number of chapters have survived from the Talmud Yerushalmi, from the Talmud of the Land of Israel, which already begin the process of really developing this area of law. So we can't say, right, and it would be foolish to say that the fact that Jews care about this area of Jewish law is because they lived in a Zoroastrian context. But what we can't say is that very interesting interactions can be noted, can be charted in specifically the Babylonian Talmud. I think part of the reason for this is because the ways in which these laws were kept or not kept was tied up with communal identity. And I talk about this in the book, not only in the case of Zoroastrians, but even apparently in the case of Syriac Christians. We have evidence that the fact that they didn't care about certain aspects of these laws was considered to be central to their identity. On the other hand, Zoroastrians and Jews, not only do they take this area of Jewish law seriously, but they saw it as really part of what it meant to be a Jew or what it meant to be a Zoroastrian. So we have these conversion stories of people leaving Zoroastrianism and becoming Christian. One colorful one, as soon as the woman leaves Zoroastrianism, she is menstruating and she contaminates the fire to kind of formalize the process by which she becomes no longer Zoroastrian. So that's the context. We already have a whole area of Jewish law before we start talking about what's happening in Babylonia. And also, it seems to be very much connected to the self-perception, maybe even the identity of these different communities. Sometimes the kind of influence that we have, I believe, is negative influence, or even there's almost like a seesaw. One example I look at in great detail and will certainly be of interest to your listeners who are familiar with this area of Jewish law is what's known as the harchakot, those distancings that take place between a husband and wife during this period of the month. There was an interesting problem having to do with this area of Jewish practice. It used to be completely connected to the loss of purity. When Jews were widely keeping the laws of purity, especially during the Second Temple, but also after it, one didn't need to have to add these extra aspects of distancings between a husband and a wife. A wife simply would not make dinner for her husband while she was impure because the husband cared about purity. It wasn't limited specifically to distancing them for, let's say, reasons of avoiding intimacy. It's only after Jews stopped being so concerned that the possibility of these laws could even develop. And that seems to have happened both in concert with and then maybe even reversal of the context. Let me just quickly describe one roller coaster ride almost in which we see this. There are a few passages in the Talmud where the rabbis are willing to entertain the possibility that a husband and wife should be separated during this period of the month. They should sleep in separate structures, separate rooms, and should not be in the same space. This was clearly entertained. It was even seen as laudable. In one instance, Rava says, "Oh, it's good if you have a chaperone keeping watch on a husband and wife during this period." And then the Talmud sort of adds, "No, no, no, you can't imagine that." And we also have a story, another one of these entertaining anecdotes. This time it's between a rabbi and a min, some kind of heretical figure, let's call it, maybe someone who is influenced by Zoroastrian ideas in this case, who challenges Jews and says, "Why don't you sleep apart? Why doesn't the woman not leave, the seclusion with her husband during this period?" And the rabbi has to come up with kind of a theological assurance that we're special, we're able to stay together and still not transgress these rules. So you can see how on the one hand they entertain it, but on the other hand, once it comes to be seen as associated with heresy, maybe Zoroastrianism, it's decided that actually no, Jewish practice, and to this day, is a kind of compromise between having these distancings, but also making sure not to go too far, not to sleep in separate bedrooms, so to speak.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the distancing, the harchakot initially are possibly a response to the Zoroastrian idea of sleeping apart. So on the one hand, those stringencies are, do bear the traces of influence, but also the leniencies bear the traces of a pushback against the influences as well. And there's a negotiation between the two sides.
That's right. And of course, I mean, these laws develop in a whole variety of ways, including well into the medieval period when there are other influences as well that have nothing to do with Zoroastrianism. But I do believe, and I do try to argue that it's a particularly Babylonian phenomenon, and it bears traces of the Zoroastrian context.
That's very interesting. And it actually comes something I wanted to ask you regarding the influence, because, often we think of influence, as you mentioned earlier, as something positive. Oh, I like what these others are doing, therefore I'm going to assimilate it into my own practice, my own ideas. But of course, there's the other side of influence, which is influence through negation or negativity. In other words, I see what's going on there, I don't like it, and therefore I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen here. I'm specifically crafting my own way of life, my own response as a negation against what I see and dislike elsewhere. I mean, is that evidence the Babylonian Talmud that rabbis making certain decisions precisely because they are appalled or deeply dissatisfied with what they see in the surrounding culture?
I mean, I think that's one such example, and I think that story about the rabbi encountering a mean expresses that quite literally. We see that this is associated with this non-rabbinic approach, and because of that, we're going to take a different direction. I think there's another, and there are many other types of complex influence, let's call it, not just in terms of pushback, but in terms of competition or other forms of competition. And this also puts pressures, interesting pressures on the rabbinic system. So one area that I explore this is in another aspect of the laws of Nida. This has to do with diagnosis, essentially, of discharges, whether they should be seen as menstrual or not. The discourse gets almost completely out of hand in the Babylonian Talmud. It's almost ready to kind of collapse on itself because one needs such a high level of expertise. One needs such almost superhuman abilities to be able to properly rule in this area of Jewish law that it almost seems as if the whole discourse is going to collapse on itself. What ends up happening, though, is the rabbis assert that they got this, they know how to do this, and in fact, a very prominent Zoroastrian woman consults them on this. And this, they tell it a story about Shapor II's mother, whom they know as Ifer Hormuz, who would send these samples of discharges to a rabbi, Rava, who lived in the 4th century, and he would diagnose these things. It seems that they're trying to really, put it out there that yes, there's been competition, but we've won, right? We are even seen as experts by Zoroastrians.
That's fascinating, I have to say. It's also fascinating, this idea that members of one religion could be sufficiently expert in a set of laws that concerns both religions, that members of a second religion consult the rabbis on these laws because they are considered experts in a shared set of laws. It reminds me, actually, just a brief aside. So I used to work a little bit in the Harvard Library's archives, right? Just sorting through archives, especially the stuff in Yiddish. And I came across a page from a Satmar newspaper, Der Yid, in the 1950s, I think. And there was a page there discussing whether Coca-Cola was kosher. Okay. And the decision was that it wasn't kosher because, they said in this newspaper, that Coca-Cola has extracts of a pig's brain. There's a pig's brain extract. And how do they know this? What's their source for this? It said that this was a declaration by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who apparently declared once Coca-Cola to be haram. Why? Because it has pig's brain extract. And on the basis of sort of this, this psak, as it were, this rabid anti-Semite and Jew hater in Jerusalem, Satmar were willing to say, no, don't drink Coca-Cola. We're going to trust him on the kashrus of Coca-Cola and their pig's brain extract. I remember reading this going, wow, that is wild that they're basing their sort of the halakhic decision on that. But
That's a great story, but I actually think it's more common. I mean, not in such extreme cases, than we sometimes think. I mean, first of all, actually, in that very area, unless in that direction, but in the opposite direction, there are many Muslims who trust kashrus to make sure that there's nothing forbidden for them to eat, and because of that, they'll trust kosher supervision. But Rashi actually responds to is struggling with exactly what this strange phenomenon, and his approach is to say, well, it must be that this figure, if her Hormuz, wanted to convert to Judaism, because otherwise, why would she trust and why would she care even the rabbis? But I don't think you necessarily need that approach that Rashi suggests there. But you could imagine this kind of sharing of what we think of sometimes as impenetrable religious knowledge between two different religious communities.
That is very, very interesting. I'd like to broach another element of your work on menstrual purity, which is the following, which is that you broach the possibility of competition or even one-upmanship between Jewish women and their Sasanian counterparts. In other words, it seems that a lot of the stringencies of menstrual purity were taken on by Jewish women or were accepted as popular religious stringency. And this leads to the question of, we've been talking a lot about the interactions between Judaism and Zoroastrianism on the sort of level of expertise and clergy and those at the religious elite who would have great knowledge of the relevant texts and the relevant traditions. But do we also have evidence of the more popular forms of religion within both Judaism and Zoroastrianism and interactions and the possible competition between them? Is that also evidenced in various degrees in the Talmud?
Sure, that's a great question, and I also do have a chapter in my book where I try to explore that possibility. It should be said that it's very hard to get there because both in the case of the Talmud and in the Zoroastrian Middle Persian texts that have come down to us, we are dealing with very elite form of literature. Um, it's composed by people who were literate and people who were highly educated. It was also composed by men, so that makes it doubly kind of complicated when you want to get a popular practice in an area which physiologically is just going to be the domain of women. But I do believe that you can hear echoes of this in the text. Actually, the text, the Babylonian Talmud, attests to a popular practice. It says, Benot Yisrael hichmiru ba'atzman, is how it talks about one particular practice, that it was actually the Jewish women who were stringent on themselves and decided to change actually a fundamental area of the menstrual laws. Now, it's actually much more complicated than that because other texts suggest that this was related to the rabbis and a rabbinic enactment of some sort. But I do believe you can sort of place this particular development, which is attributed to Jewish women, alongside other movements that we have in Zoroastrian Middle texts, in actually the text of another religious group, the Mandeans, and use it as a way of doing the best we can, at least, to get at a popular practice, a popular female practice, even though what we have to work with is an elite set of texts, which were composed by men. I think you can get there, but you have to be very careful not to, say anything too definitive.
Right. This is something that's often forgotten when people ask things of historians like this. And the answer often is that the evidence is thin on the ground at best, and therefore difficult to make strong pronouncements. I'd like to ask for a moment about the non-halachic elements of the Talmud, because we've been speaking a lot about the law and development of the law and halakha and interactions. Because of course, a large portion, perhaps even the majority of the Babylonian Talmud is non-halachic, is what they call agadic, folkloric, or ethical passages, and all sorts of other things. And within those, the non-halachic passages of the Talmud, do we also see elements of contention or interaction or engagement with the Zoroastrian or external culture?
I think we do. One really interesting area where I think that happens is in how the Talmud describes what the afterlife looks like. In earlier sources, we really have very, very little in terms of what Jews think about what the afterlife is like. And to be honest, even in the Talmud itself, we have snippets here and there, descriptions of post-mortem punishments, theological ways of thinking about places like hell. So I actually argue in my first book that maybe two of these look very, very similar to what we find in Zoroastrian texts. One is the post-mortem punishment that the text describes happening to the spies who slander the land of Israel in the Torah. They're described, their post-mortem punishment is described as their tongue being pulled out of their mouth up to their belly button, and various worms and creatures crawling back and forth. This is precisely how slander is described in the Zoroastrian version of Dante's Inferno, where this is what slander, the punishment for slander looks like. And even, I think, more interesting and kind of almost shocking thing that we find in the Talmud and in Zoroastrian texts on the question of hell has to do with the story of Joseph, who is tempted by Potiphar's wife in the Bible. He manages successfully to avoid the temptation. And one of the ways he does this is by realizing that if he were to sleep with Potiphar's wife, then he would be bound to her like a dog. Tied to her like a dog is how it's described in the passage. This actually is a reference to copulation that could be proven on philological grounds. And the idea would be that he would be sexually connected to this person in the afterlife as well. That seems to line up also with Zoroastrian ideas of the afterlife. If one is good, one is unified, probably even sexually, with a desirable partner. And if one is not good, then the afterlife is experienced as being sexually unified with an undesirable partner. So these texts seem to be in conversation with one another. They're theological, they're agadic, and I think there's much more to explore.
Fair enough. As you say, there is an enormous amount to explore, and anything we can talk about is just scratching the surface, and especially as more investigations are done in this area. I'd like to end off a little bit by asking one or two just sort of meta questions more on the discipline that you've been part of and have played a big part in developing. The first is, it is a historical curiosity that for centuries already, many have written about the historical context of Judaism as it grew up in the Roman Empire and the Greco-Roman context, right? So the context of the Mishnah and the context of the Yerushalmi and the sort of Greco-Roman elements to be found in rabbinic literature and Greek words and concepts like apikoros or gematria or all these things that were clearly borrowed from that kind of context. And yet, until very recently, and even now, precious little attention has been paid to the Babylonians, to the Sasanian. Why has this been the case? What is it? Just because there were more classicists trained in European universities than there were, Iranists? I mean, why is it that there's such a heavy emphasis on one and not the other?
I think that is one of the reasons. It does have to do with the structure of higher education and research. That's certainly part of it. This actually is not only a new area. Rather early on in the history of kind of scientific approaches, academic approaches to the Talmud, there was interest paid. That was actually part of a kind of maskilic reformist endeavor associated with figures like Shor, a Galician maskil, who wanted to point out areas of superstition in Jewish thinking and Jewish law, and therefore to disqualify and say, we don't need that anymore. We are going to reform what Judaism will be going forward. And one of the ways that he did this would be to point to areas of quote unquote Persian superstition, which influenced the Talmud. So there already was a sort of negative energy in terms of thinking about the possibilities of Zoroastrian influence and the Zoroastrian context more generally with the Talmud. I think that negativity stayed and also led to some hesitation of doing this kind of work going forward. But again, I think actually one more point has to do with the status of the Babylonian Talmud in academic Jewish studies more generally. Ironically, I mean, you began by talking about how central this text is in Jewish learning. That is certainly true, and it remains true as well. But for a variety of reasons, the Babylonian Talmud in general, not just in terms of the question of Persian influence, has not merited kind of sustained study along the type we see of texts that were produced in the land of Israel. I think part of that has to do with Zionism and the relationship between Zionism and Jewish studies scholarship. And it also has to do, on the other hand, with a sense that the Babylonian Talmud should not be contaminated, let's say. We don't want, elements do not want to go in the way that these earlier figures did. We want to keep this as sort of the holy of holies. And therefore, many people are uncomfortable with looking for influence in the Babylonian Talmud, while they're much more comfortable finding it in the Mishnah and the Yerushalmi. But I think most of those things, certainly within the realm of academic Jewish studies, are long in the past. There's genuine interest in this area. It is harder to conduct because you don't have the same resources, you don't have the same sources, something we really didn't get to, that you would have in terms of classics. But there is energy, there is interest, and I'm confident that we're going to see a lot more great discoveries in the coming years.
Yes, I mean, I hope so. It is interesting. I wonder if also, I mean, I suppose quite a fair amount of the early Jewish studies research, especially in the 19th century, were coming from people who had specifically run away from the Cheder. The early Maskilim and those members of the Wissenschaft, the students who had spent a lot of their youth in a very traditional kind of learning environment, and then spent much of their adult life running away from that, and they ended up all across the religious and ideological spectrum. And they were certainly fascinated in the history of Jewish literature, but it seems plausible to argue they were primarily interested in things that they were not taught in their youth, namely medieval Jewish philosophy or what have you, or even the Bible or whatever it is. And so perhaps there was at any rate this sort of psychological resistance against going back and excavating the Talmud once again. It's a theory at any rate. Perhaps there's some validity to it. A final question I want to ask, and this is sort of in view of the fact that many of the people listening to this will be, traditional religious Jews and will study the Talmud fairly frequently. How important do you feel it is in order to understand the Gemara, in order to understand the Babylonian Talmud, to know something about its Sasanian context, as you've written? In other words, is it the case that someone, studying yeshiva or someone who's doing daf yomi ought to be reading books like yours and books like your colleagues are producing in order to understand what's going on? Or is it legitimate or profitable to study the Talmud without these contexts? How religiously important is the work that you do? I'm not sure I'm phrasing it completely correctly, but I think you understand what I mean.
I think I do. I do believe that it's valuable, even religiously valuable. I mean, one of the things that's central to learning, especially learning Gemara, is getting it right. Just understanding what the text is saying. And there are occasions, I'm not saying it happens every day, but there are occasions where one can benefit from knowledge, not just of the Zoroastrian context, but the entire world in which the Talmud was composed. You have to know something about commerce. Right now in Daf Yomi, actually do give Daf Yomi regularly. I give a Daf Yomi shir here in Modi'in, where I'm usually based. You'll often encounter things. What does commerce look like? What does it look like? How do you hire someone? That to better understand what's happening in the passage, it pays to know something about the context. I also think, and maybe I'll just end on this point, if you're not just, it's not just about Daf Yomi, but you are a religious Jew and religious learning is important to you, and you want to understand kind of what the Talmud is. What is it that we're spending so much time occupying ourselves with? I think there too, it's valuable to think about the broader context. What did it mean to live a life, not just a life of the mind, but in our case, a life of the text? I think there are answers, and it's one of the things I'm working on right now. What makes the Talmud look the way it does more broadly? So different than almost every other text that you can encounter in the Jewish bookshelf and outside of it. I think part of those big meta questions almost, part of the answer is going to come from an appreciation of how texts were produced in the Sasanian Empire. I won't give away more than that, but there will be a book coming out on that topic, hopefully in the next few years. And I think it's important as well.
That is fascinating. Of course, many of the listeners here who would be listening to this will be very jealous of you that you essentially make a full-time living learning Gemara within an academic context, and that sounds like the dream, at least for many here. Anyway, Professor Shai Secunda, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been a pleasure, and I look forward to releasing this to the public.
Great. It's good to be speaking with you, and keep up the good work that you're doing.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.